All right, look, it's recording.
Awesome.
Perfect. All right, so we do have a lot to talk about today, specifically because of Paul Carter's new podcast with Chris Beardsley. Everyone's going crazy over it, so I've watched it a couple times. I'm not. I think you heard it, right?
I've listened through about everything but the last 20 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, I know Chris also posted something on his Patreon talking about a summary of the stuff. So I would like to get through every single point, but I would like to say thank you for meeting with me today. And maybe we could start off with just who you are, um, maybe your experience in the field, and how your expertise led to specifically hypertrophy training. If you could give us a rundown through that.
Sure. So, my name is Milo Wolf. I'm doing my PhD on the effects of range of motion during resistance training on muscle hypertrophy and strength. Um, what led me here is when I was about 14 years old, I got into lifting, gradually got more interested in the science behind it. So, I started reading, for example, Strong by Science or Strength Theory at the time. Um, Gradually got more interested in it, and when it came time to decide what I wanted to do after school, I thought that the only thing that really interested me in any major way was sports science, or the science of how to get jacked, essentially. Um, Applied for some undergraduate programs in the UK, went to the UK, did my undergrad in sports science at Loughborough University, and then from there went to Solent University to do my PhD, and now I'm currently about a month and a half away from submitting my thesis and hopefully being done with my PhD within the next few months.
Oh, congratulations!
Thank you, man. Thank you.
I
And
heard getting a PhD is gets really intense near the end. I remember someone saying it's like before focusing on saving the world, just focus on finishing your PhD first.
yeah, pretty much. I'd say for most people, especially in the UK, well, in countries outside of the US, in the US, a PhD is generally a lot longer and your hand is being held a lot more. Like, as in, you have lectures, you continue having teaching, etc. during that time. Whereas in the UK, for example, a PhD, the only thing I'm really entitled to is about 8 meetings a year minimum with my supervisors, where they might give me some overall guidance, but otherwise you're essentially on your own. And so for most PhD students in the UK, in my experience, and from the people I've spoken to, for the first year or two, you're kind of, walking along, chilling, kind of trying to figure things out, and then you realize, oh wait a minute, time's been passing by pretty quickly, and so the last year or the last few months typically is a sprint to the finish line. Um, but yeah, I've also competed in bodybuilding myself. I've competed in powerlifting, so I've got some background in both strength and physique sports as well now.
Yeah, it's always good to put your foot in the mud, just to get a better understanding of those things. And you do work with, have you worked with people like Brad and all those pretty
Yep,
popular people in
yep.
fitness?
So I've collaborated with Brad on a few papers. I'm going to be visiting him in New York in a month or so, and then I'm going to be staying in New York for a month or so to help out with some data collection in fall. Um, I'm also working for Strong by Science at the moment, so working at holes in air tracks, learning all those people. As a coach, also as a coach from my own company, I've been coaching for 4 or 5 years as well. Um, and in the past, I've also worked for Dr. Mike Israel of Renaissance Periodization. So yeah, I've been around, you know.
Yeah, those are really big names. So it's good to have people who have connections with them. Really good viewpoints from all different sides. Um, there's a lot to go over today. I made sure to write down a list of the things I kind of want to hit that are most important, and then with the time we have left, we could do like a little Q and A at the end for the people who ask some questions. And specifically, before we just start getting into anything, I kind of want to see your definition on what is this stretch-mediated hypertrophy, um, and saying would you consider it an absolute yet, or is it still a hypothesis that we're pretty unsure of? Um, do you have, rather than just saying muscles train at longer lengths or they grow better at longer lengths, like I could work with that, but maybe if we could go a little deeper in the definition of what it really is.
Sure. So at this point, I think the concept of stretch-mediated hypertrophy is reasonably well established. That said, the mechanisms behind it aren't. So it is pretty consistent that when training a muscle group at longer lengths, all else being equal, there seems to be more hypertrophy than when training at shorter lengths. Um, the term stretch-mediated hypertrophy is a bit of a misnomer in the sense that you likely don't just get that hypertrophy by stretching a muscle group, right? because you could be passively stretching a muscle group at an intensity of like 1 out of 10, like when you're doing static stretching, for example, and that won't necessarily result in much hypertrophy. So it's not necessarily stretch-mediated hypertrophy as much as it is longer muscle length training hypertrophy in a way, because you need to still apply sufficient tension, etc. It still needs to be reasonably challenging and so forth. With regards to whether it's a hypothesis or whether I think it's pretty established at this point, I'd say it's pretty established. When you're looking at the full range of motion versus partial range of motion literature, when you're looking at the partial range of motion versus partial range of motion at different muscle length literature, when you're looking at the 5 studies comparing isometric contractions at different muscle lengths on hypertrophy literature, it's pretty consistent that the idea of more hypertrophy existing when training at longer muscle lengths compared to shorter muscle lengths, it's pretty consistent. And so generally, stretch-mediated hypertrophy I would define as any additional hypertrophy occurring as a result of training at longer than normal muscle lengths.
I know I made I believe it was a TikTok talking about that. Basically the fitness community online just takes stretch-mediated hypertrophy in absolute, and they go, this is why they grow, this is how they grow. We'll get to why they grow in a minute, depending on Chris's definition of it. And I said it was a hypothesis, and I think people tend to get confused, and they started spamming me with studies. They're like, this proves everything. I'm like, well, I should have specified I meant the mechanisms of it, because people think to take an absolute that the mechanism is because passive tension. But we're going to get into passive tension later, but I don't think it's that simple. I wanted to hear your thoughts. The first things I wanted to go over was sarcomeogenesis, I think you pronounced that right, and myofibrogenesis, which I don't know why they split it up into that. I mean, to me, the way I learned it and studied it was just sarcomerogenesis, which has 2 mechanisms, fibers growing in series, and for the people who are confused on that, it's like just the fibers kind of go in chains, and then if they go in parallel, they kind of just like stack on top of each other. Paul Carter says myofibrogenesis. I don't think there's a huge difference. I could be wrong. But I wanted to see your interpretation on Chris's definition about him specifically quoting extra hypertrophy isn't coming from the same source. When we talk about stretch-mediated hypertrophy, it's rather coming from the addition of that sarcomere series with the myofibro hypertrophy.
Sure. So I can see where he's coming from. The chief issue with... So I listened to the podcast episode recently, I think a few days ago only. There's kind of 2 main issues I took with that line of reasoning. The first is the assumption that passive tension is the only mechanism or the mechanism at play when it comes to quote-unquote stretch-mediated hypertrophy. We just don't have any direct evidence suggesting or even providing strong evidence that's the case, right? There could be a variety of other things at play. It's really not that clear. It's unclear to what extent passive tension is even experienced, for example, during a lot of the protocols used in these studies on range of motion, right? Like when you look at the length-tension relationship of a single fiber or a single muscle group, you know, for some muscle groups, even the length-tension relationship isn't super well established. But let's say we look at the length-tension relationship of a given fiber, right? It's unclear to what extent passive tension is experienced during, say, a squat to parallel during one of these studies, and whether or not that's even enough tension to really cause a difference. Certainly, there's enough other mechanisms that could be at play that I'm not confident that we can say, oh, it's passive tension for sure. It's just like we haven't measured that directly in the context of these studies. So it's kind of a mechanism that might contribute to hypertrophy taken almost out of context and then applied to a whole sort of area of evidence, and I'm not confident that's the case. With regards to what type of hypertrophy is occurring, again, we don't have a ton of actual data looking at that in the context of these studies. Relatively few of these studies look at hypertrophy beyond muscle thickness or what have you. What I will say is that generally with longer muscle length training induced hypertrophy or stretch-mediated hypertrophy or what have you, it is generally the case that more distal hypertrophy is seen. Sometimes a bit more proximal hypertrophy is seen, so proximal hypertrophy referring to hypertrophy at more proximal sites of a muscle group, but generally you see disproportionately more hypertrophy following lower muscle length training at more distal measurement sites. Whether that means that it's purely due to sarcomerogenesis, I don't know. Again, we don't have much data on that regarding range of motion and muscle length training. I think it's one potential mechanism that could be at play, but again, we just don't have the evidence to say that that's for sure what's happening here.
Right. And what would you say with his I guess, quote on saying that active tension growth tends to be from just an increase in cross-sectional area or a fiber diameter, or myofibrils in parallel, I guess different ways to say it. And would you say like passive tension growth really only comes from sarcomeres in series? As you just said, we don't really have the evidence to support that. So with that quote saying that active tension only grows sarcomeres or cross-sectional area, would you say that's a bit of a stretch to come up with that claim?
Nice one. Bit of a stretch. I like it. Um, yeah, I'd say so. I'd say we're taking certain physiological sort of basics, quote unquote, and applying them to a different context entirely. I think because we don't have much mechanistic evidence with regards to range of motion and muscle training yet, I'm just not confident in saying that that's definitely, it's not that cut and square, you know? Like we don't know for sure that, okay, long muscle training grows mostly via doing it in series versus in parallel. It's just not likely it based on the evidence we have. I think it's a very simplistic way to look at things. It's a very reductionist way of looking at things. And I think until we have further evidence, I'm just not ready to pin down the whole of stretch-mediated hypertrophy to being an increase in fascicle length or to being hypertrophy more in series rather than parallel. I just don't think we have the evidence to support that claim yet at all. So,
right. And I think this whole thing with sarcomeres in series and parallel, everyone's like just blurring it out. When I remember reading about these things, it was really more so about muscle shapes. Some muscles just tend to have more sarcomeres packed up into that sectional area to produce more force, but they might sacrifice some velocity, I think it was. But I never seemed to kind of apply it into the sense of muscle growth until recently with all this. Would you say it was only due to muscle shapes? Because I know people are also in the whole thing with like choosing exercises because of muscle shapes. I've heard some people say I'm going to choose a exercise of high force production because the glutes are a pennant muscle or something like that. And I'm like, I don't think that's. I don't do that. I just stick with basic principles. Your thoughts on that?
yeah, absolutely. I'm not really convinced on the shape of a muscle having a ton of impact on practically what exercise you should be doing. Um, it's a lot of these ideas stemming from either very fundamental physiology or very fundamental biomechanics that are then directly applied to practical applications can often mislead you, right? Like I think when you're looking at the basics of muscle physiology and then trying to make inferences on how that would apply to studies that haven't measured anything remotely related to that, you can make a lot of mistakes. So, as an example, there's a lot of, I'd call it theory crafting at this point, about which muscle groups may or may not respond to stretch-mediated hypertrophy. Ultimately, rather than picking my favorite mechanism and interpreting a whole body of evidence in light of that without any evidence, direct evidence looking at it, I would rather look at the direct studies that have looked at those muscle groups, right? And seeing if we can draw a generalizable principle that, you know, we can certainly modify down the line if more data comes out that is to the contrary, but that can be like, okay, well, it seems like most muscle groups respond favorably to this thing, right? So when you have, I want to say, 3 or 4 studies on the biceps, 3 or 4 studies on the triceps, 1 study on the calves, 2 studies on the quads looking only at length and partials for range of motion. When you have data across a variety of muscle groups, and sure you can point out certain limitations, for example, about the bicep studies, that some of them looked at the elbow flexors grouped together versus just the biceps and so forth, and it comes down to neuromechanical matching. And there may or may not be some truth to that. Ultimately, that's the thing with this claim specifically about neuromechanical matching, is that we have only 1 study looking at the effects of matching the strength and resistance curve of an exercise to, well, the strength curve of a muscle group or muscle groups to an exercise resistance curve and how it impacts hypertrophy. And that 1 study essentially found no real impact of doing that positively for hypertrophy. So I think when you're making theoretical claims about why matching the strength curve of a muscle group to the resistance curve of an exercise would be better for hypertrophy, it's a thing that's neat in concept and it is intuitively logical, right? Like, oh yeah, if you want to train the biceps optimally, then you got to load the exercise most heavily where the biceps have the best leverage, so that they get trained the best and get a good hypertrophy response. But that just hasn't really panned out in the research, and or there just isn't any direct research supporting that concept yet. And so I'd rather look at the direct evidence comparing partials of different muscle lengths, or full range of motion versus partial range of motion, because that's ultimately actually measuring what we care about, which is hypertrophy. The mechanism we can potentially figure out later. At the very least, right now, we don't have enough evidence to figure it out for sure. So that's why for the time being I'm reluctant to accept either neuromechanical matching as the principle, well, the mechanism underlying all of these differences in hypertrophy following longer versus shorter muscle length training, or any single mechanism for the time being. What I'm willing to do is observe patterns, like, oh, well, it looks like consistently longer muscle length training leads to more hypertrophy, and more hypertrophy specifically at distal measurement sites. Whether that's due to X or Y mechanism, I couldn't say for sure yet.
Well, since we're already talking about the neuromechanical matching model, I might as well just like kind of skip to that. And for people who aren't familiar with that, would you agree in the definition to say that it's basically, I guess a really simple way to put it, it's like muscles tend to grow where they have the best leverage. I mean, that's how people have been defining it.
Yeah, sure. I think that's fine. There's a few small things I take issue with. The first one is I don't really enjoy using jargon where jargon isn't necessary. So, like, for example, when I first heard the words neuromechanical matching, I was like, I'm sorry, what? Like, and I'm doing my PhD in sports science. Like, things should come reasonably naturally to me compared to most people. And obviously, it's a relatively intuitive idea ultimately. It's basically matching the resistance curve of a task with a strength curve of a certain muscle group, to make them grow the most. Now, there's a few issues there. One issue is that if a task is taken to failure, like for example, if you're doing pull downs to failure, right? And pull down involves, let's say, an underhand pull down, mostly involves elbow flexion and shoulder extension. If that set is taken to failure, even if there are relative differences in the leverage of different muscle groups during that range of motion, if it's taken to failure, and training a muscle group to complete exhaustion isn't necessary for hypertrophy, in all likelihood, all of the muscle groups are going to get a pretty good stimulus out of it. Like, let's say, for example, the biceps have worse leverage than, well, let's say the lats have worse leverage above about 120 degrees, which I think is often said by Paul Coyle or what have you. Above 120 degrees, the lats lose leverage, and thus maybe other muscle groups take over, right? Assuming we're still talking about relatively small differences in leverage, the lats would still be trained above 120 degrees. And assuming you're taking a set to failure, the lats would also be trained relatively close to failure, right? Even if the lats aren't the quote-unquote the first group to fail out of the shoulder extensors. And so because the evidence on training to failure, for example, suggests that we don't need to train a muscle group to failure to see optimal hypertrophy, for example, in all likelihood, even if they don't have optimal leverage throughout the whole range of motion, so what? Who gives a shit, So I think conceptually it makes sense again, but practically it hasn't been examined. Like the one study I mentioned where it's by Staniszewski and colleagues in 2020, where they had two groups. Both groups used the same program. One group trained with machines that tried to match the strength curve of the individual to the resistance curve of the exercise, whereas one group trained with traditional exercises where there was no attempt to be made to match strength and resistance curves. And they saw no hypertrophy differences between the two groups. So even the one study that's been done on this sort of concept, broadly speaking, right? And you could argue, yes, but that's matching the resistance curve of an exercise to the strength curve of several muscle groups at once. So you could argue that maybe it just didn't, it wasn't granular enough. It didn't just match, for example, a bicep curl resistance curve to the strength curve of the biceps specifically. But even the most direct investigations of that concept that we have don't show a benefit. So I'm very, very skeptical of a mechanism that has no direct basis looking at hypertrophy, explaining a whole body of evidence on range of motion and muscle length training. It's a stretch. Again, pun intended, But that's why I'm a bit skeptical of that mechanism explaining all of the findings in the body of evidence so far.
Right. And I mean, that is a hypothesis, though, then, right?
Well, I mean, when you say the principle of neuromechanical matching and then apply it to hypertrophy, depending on how you communicate it, it can come off as being quite a strong assertion, let's say. Like, for example, when I listen to the podcast, the language used oftentimes to me struck me as being quite strong with regards to neuromechanical matching and explaining some of the findings and saying, Fasicle length increases at lower muscle length training are super well documented, but they stop after like 6 weeks or 8 weeks, what have you. And I think those are pretty strong claims, like pretty high degrees of confidence being stated when we don't necessarily have any evidence to back that up.
With that, I would like to say that I was talking to Andrew Vygotsky some time
That's a
ago.
light flex, by the way.
What happened?
That's a light flex, by the way. He's a report guy.
He's yeah, for people who don't know him, he's pretty well known in the. He's not super well known to the average fitness person, but for like the researchers, he's a really smart guy. He
There's a term in hip hop which is like your favorite rapper's favorite rapper. It's basically kind of your favorite sports scientist's favorite sports scientist.
Yeah, I really like the guy. He was nice. I don't know how. I just saw him on Twitter and I messaged him, and for some reason we just been talking like that. So it's cool. I'll ask him questions and just to clarify some things. And I was talking about the neuromechanical matching model, and he was talking about how it's not an all or none type of thing. It's muscles are recruited on a continuum. So even if they grant that as being true, or the hypothesis being true, loads will be spread across different muscles. And then there's a whole thing of research. There's evidence supporting that changing a joint's angles where muscles doesn't cross can change the muscle's excitability. So he says it's a lot more complicated than just saying this model. And with Paul trying, because he did reach out to me the other day, not in the most welcoming way, but I mean, I don't expect much anymore.
Hey, that's Paul. Let's fucking go.
I try to be nice because I do have hope that one day he'll be like, okay, you know what, it's okay, and I'm like, oh. But it's hard because when you do try to have a discussion with him, or what may look like a debate, an argument, he does have like sources ready to fire at you, and it's like not all he's saying is wrong, but I feel like he just mixes really strong claims with these sources, and it tends to like really trick people because they're like, okay, he just put a PMID, or something like that, and it does state that what he said it's there in the paper, so therefore it must be true. But then for the people who just start reading studies, I remember that's how I used to be. I used to see that and I'm like, okay, that's true. But then the more I looked into it, the more I talked to people, and the more I tried to study with it, I was like, that's actually a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah, and it's funny as well because even in the podcast, at one point they go back at one tricep study in 1995 or so, I think. And don't get me wrong, I think both Chris and Paul have a reasonable understanding of physiology, right? Like they have a reasonable, compared to like, I don't know, the average sports science undergraduate, they have a pretty reasonable understanding of physiology.
I'll consider them really smart, especially Chris. I sometimes like he has some really good stuff that I like to read.
Yeah. The issue there is, for example, that study, they acknowledged that it was 5 people. Like it was 5 people in about 12 weeks, 14 weeks, what have you. I don't think they understand. Like I think once you've conducted research and actually spent some time learning about research methods, stats, etc., you kind of understand that with 5 participants or even with 10 participants, and that's why oftentimes in sports science we wait until we have like several studies to even really say anything, right? Because with small sample sizes, it's remarkably easy to get false positives, especially when you add, for example, publication bias into the equation, where significant findings are more likely to get published, or interesting findings are more likely to get published. And so when you have like only a couple studies, and they have like 5 people per study, you can find some findings that aren't necessarily replicable or trustworthy. So that's why you generally wait for a while. And so while in my estimation they have a decent understanding of physiology, sometimes their interpretation of physiology and how it applies to training contexts, and their understanding of, okay, well, we have this study. Is the study actually worth much in the grand scheme of things? That interpretation is a bit more sketchy. The final thing I'll say, going back to neuromechanical matching, is there is a second assumption built into that. So there's the first question of, well, does, quote-unquote, the principle of neuromechanical matching exist, right? Like, do different muscles get recruited at to different extents depending on what their leverage is? The answer there, from what I understand at least, is likely yes, right? The second question is, to what extent is this relevant within most lifting contexts? Like, is there a meaningful enough difference in recruitment at different joint angles for most exercises for it to really make a big difference in hypertrophy? If so, that might help explain some of the muscle length research. If not, Probably not. Based on the evidence we have, the differences in recruitment based on neuromechanical matching may just not be large enough to really cause a difference. And that's why, until we have evidence suggesting that it does, it's not my most likely explanation for why we see stretch-mediated hypertrophy. I'm open to being proven wrong, certainly, but I think for the time being, we just have so many assumptions built into that I'm just not ready to accept it as like the be-all, end-all mechanism for this concept.
Right. And then there's the whole complexity with internal moment arms. For the people who, I guess, do math or take engineering, I guess a moment arm problem, simple or not, depending how good you are at it. It is relatively simple because they give you a certain area, they give you some things to work with. But if you look at a joint and a tendon, there's so many different forces and things like that. It's I read a paper looking at the complexities, and it's like a lot of the math is not necessarily, I don't want to say there, but it's like we just aren't sure yet.
Yeah, and that's kind of why earlier I mentioned, for example, that for a lot of muscle groups, we don't even have necessarily a very well-established length-tension relationship for whole muscle groups. And so when you try and make inferences about, like try and explain studies results away with just that, when we don't even have super accurate representations of that stuff yet, that's why generally I prefer sticking to looking at the outcomes that we actually care about versus looking at the mechanisms first. Because I think it's good, right? I think it's good to try and generate some theories, but I think that the theories should attempt to be internally consistent. Like you can actually be consistent in how you explain things, and for that theory to still explain the results of the studies that we actually see, right? So in this case, if they stick by neuromechanical matching and it actually accurately explains the results of what we're seeing, fair enough. But in this case, we just don't have a good enough definition of what each muscle's length-tension relationship is, how much of a role that plays in actually changing hypertrophy, whether or not the differences in recruitment are meaningful enough to result in meaningful differences in hypertrophy. And then the next thing is, well, okay, assuming that's the case, how well does this actually explain differences in hypertrophy comparing shorter to longer muscle length training in these studies? So before all that is addressed, in my mind, I'd rather look at the hypertrophy results and say, well, very consistently, longer muscle length training appears to result in more hypertrophy across a variety of muscle groups, at least in the context of how most people lift. You know, whether that's due to increased passive tension, I don't know. It might be. Passive tension isn't my quote-unquote leading mechanism of choice when I think of how to explain this. But that's why I'm a bit skeptical of that explanation for now.
Yeah, and I want to go into passive tension and the descending limb length, because that's basically their entire theory on why muscles tend to benefit more. And when you look at it from like the grand scheme of things, or from like just a surface level kind of view, it sounds good. And I used to go by that. I'm like, oh, this makes a lot of sense, the descending limb length, this and that. I started looking more into it, and as soon as I know Chris posted the study on the biceps, he made an infographic showing that the biceps don't reach the descending limb length. I don't remember the name of the study, but when I read it, the biceps seemed to reach, if I remember, it was like 1.25, which is very much on the descending limb length. And then if you were to model that in OpenSim, which is like where I guess a lot of biomechanists model their interpretations of how muscles somewhat move, it's in the descending limb length when you do movements like shoulder extension or like an incline bicep curl. And then Paul proceeded to say, I know, Kasim Hansen, are you familiar with him? He was saying that that study was measuring sarcomere length, just a single sarcomere length. And then Paul was like, no, they were measuring normalized sarcomere length. Regardless of what it is, that study, I think it was just an extrapolation of a cadaver studies. And cadavers, basically, I haven't done the cadaver class where it's like you actually look at the cadaver, but I have friends that have. And the muscles are dehydrated, they're flat, and if you apply that to the real world, it just doesn't perfectly align with it. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the bicep study, but if you are, do you have any?
Which one?
I don't remember the name. I should have wrote it down.
Yeah, no, just describe the design real quick, and I should be able to.
It was
The preacher curl one?
No. It was a human movement. It was like the human movement something. It wasn't measuring muscle growth or anything. It was just measuring like the the sarcomere
I
length
got you.
of the muscle.
Yeah. Okay. No, I
Um,
haven't seen that one.
no, I could send it. I should have wrote it down, but it had a pretty long name to it. Regardless, I ended up talking to, and I want to hear your point on this. I ended up talking to. Are you familiar with Rick Lieber, Dr. Rick Lieber?
Yeah, I've seen his name around in some research. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, well,
Yep.
I've seen his name on a lot of research, so I decided to see if I could find a way to reach out to him. And I ended up discussing with him. He's a super nice guy, actually, through email. I sent him Chris's thing on the biceps length tension relationship, and he just replied with he hasn't really seen anything that supports the literature on bicep lat reaching descending limb length. And he said that he clearly showed that we can't really measure sarcomere length through biomechanical models. He didn't really send me the study supporting that, but I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. I know measuring sarcomere length could be much more complicated than what we make it seem. I know, and then I showed Paul that, and Paul just goes, "Oh, but that theory has been disproven many times." Well, so I sent that, and then I went to Rick Lieber. I feel like a median, and Rick Lieber goes, "This is just a really complicated process," and he sent me a lot of papers, and he goes, "Read this, and then we can get into the specifics." And
Yeah, I feel like when one person tells you something disproven or proven, and one person tells you, oh, it's complicated, generally the person acknowledging complexity is probably a bit more on the money, you know?
yeah, but are you familiar with with measuring sarcomere length? Do you think that is, pretty well understood? Is it not understood? I know Andrew Vygotsky also has a really good article talking about the misconceptions of sarcomere lengths.
Yeah, so I'm not super familiar with it. I will say, with a lot of these mechanisms, again, I'm not sure how directly they pertain to range of motion in the muscle length debate. Um, I think that's why this whole topic is relatively interesting to a lot of people. Obviously, it has practical applications as well, but it's because there's a lot of debate around what mechanisms are at play. But I can say I'm super familiar with the measurement of sarcomere length and how that impacts things.
Well, well, if we're going to talk about sarcomere length, I do want to talk about fascicle length too. And I remember you put in a video saying that the research doesn't conclude that stretch-mediated hypertrophy is fascicle dependent. Um, or could you clarify on that, how it doesn't conclude that? Because I know Paul makes the claim where it's like, oh, well, the first person that says about biceps, so I asked them, did they measure fascicle length? And if not, there's no way to tell if stretch-mediated hypertrophy has really occurred. So, I'd like to know more on that standpoint.
Sure. So, when that claim is made that the only way to tell whether stretch-mediated hypertrophy has occurred is via measuring fascicle length, that's reducing stretch-mediated hypertrophy as a concept down to fascicle length adaptations, right? Which is not necessarily true. In fact, it may very well not be true. And that's kind of what I'm getting at overall, is that fascicle length adaptations are far from being quote-unquote proven, and I very much, quotation marks on the proven word, because you can't really prove that sort of thing. But it's very far from being well established that fascicle length adaptations are the way, or even the primary way, that stretch-mediated hypertrophy quote-unquote happens. Like, you see, especially distal hypertrophy, or distal stretch-mediated hypertrophy, very consistently. Um, Even in studies where fascicle length adaptations don't occur sometimes. So I think reducing stretch-mediated hypertrophy down to fascicle length adaptations makes it so that you can apply the same line of reasoning very consistently, but it's not a true assumption, so your whole kind of line of reasoning falls apart. And so I think that's generally why Paul and Chris have kind of made that claim, is because it makes it a bit simpler, it fits their model, and it's just not necessarily true. We don't have
Right.
the evidence reporting that it's the only thing that happens and the only thing underlying stretch-mediated hypertrophy.
And there always seems to be like some sort of bias in the scientific community with some researchers. And that's the whole thing with like longitudinal hypertrophy, which is related to the eccentric contraction things. And that's, I guess, the same thing, type of adaptations. Something I always get asked is, I saw Chris also claim that when muscles are stretched, they need to somewhat have leverage in that stretch position because the the GTO, the Golgi tendon organ, tends to be inhibited, and I guess the CNS signals, central nervous system signals, get compressed. Therefore, I guess the signals can't really go through. I think that's active insufficiency or something like that.
Passive insufficiency, yeah.
Passive insufficiency, sorry.
Yep.
And then someone had thrown a study at me. It was like PMID, I have it right here, 27504484. And basically that just said when muscles are stretched, they can likely have a decrease in motor neuron firing signals and GTO compression. My first question to that was, can fibers overcome that GTO inhibition signal? Or are you familiar with anything?
Yep. So there's a few. Well, again, it's an interesting thing. There's a few considerations there. Number one, yes, generally part of the reason you get stronger after the first few months of lifting is because your body essentially learns to not respond to the GTO that much anymore, or as much. When you first start lifting, your GTO signals are still pretty strong, whereas as you get more advanced, they generally weaken. The second thing is, this is very mechanistic reasoning. I'm not sure that in most lifting exercises you ever get close to being in passive insufficiency or to that being an issue, right? Like, you don't usually, and the reason I say this is because passive insufficiency to an extent should be reasonably straightforward to assess in a way, right? It's probably not a binary switch. It's not like okay, you're at this muscle length, you're fine. Oh no, you're at this one, you can't produce any force anymore. It's very much on a spectrum, right? But in practice, because when you're in passive insufficiency, by definition, the amount of active tension you're able to produce drops quite substantially, you should be able to tell by just how much weight you're able to lift to an extent, right? So in most exercises, I'm willing to wager that you don't get close to passive insufficiency, even if you try and lift with full range of motion or with the best stretch you can get. So I'm not sure how much of a concern that is. The second thing then is, the one thing I didn't understand, and it's honestly, this might be down to me not having read the same papers as Chris or as Paul or what have you, but I'm just not sure I've seen any evidence suggesting that you need to be able to activate the muscle in order for them to benefit from passive tension. Because if the whole train of thought here is that passive tension is what's behind stretch-mediated hypertrophy, I'm not sure the muscles and the structures of some of the connective tissue, etc., are all being lengthened and experiencing passive tension, whether the muscle group is activated to a large extent or not, at least in my understanding. And so it shouldn't really matter. And if the whole understanding of stretch-mediated hypertrophy comes down to passive tension, I'm not sure how much it matters that the muscle has leverage or is able to produce a lot of active tension. So again, I'm a bit skeptical of that line of reasoning.
Okay. And again, with passive tension, I guess, being the main driver, I know Chris and Paul were saying that Titin, the molecular protein, giant molecular protein, whatever, is responsible for this. I think Brad Schoenfeld was it him that had some papers? I think he talked about like the hippo-yapentase pathway. You're familiar with that? He also talked about the nuclear flattening theory, and I heard something about the filament CBAC3. I'm not too familiar. I haven't heard anything on that one, but I think I saw some things on Brad saying about hippo-yapentase pathway being another signal, or the nuclear flattening theory. Are you familiar with those, or?
Yeah, so I'm somewhat familiar with it. What I will say is that Titin is certainly one of the proteins that can be involved in the muscle growth signaling pathways. There is the potential for other proteins to be involved too, though. So it's not as simple as, again, reducing it down to just Titin. There are other kinases involved. There are some where, depending on the muscle length being trained, for example, some of the proteins, depending on the muscle length being trained, may be positioned in such a way as to be able to be phosphorylated more readily, and that might then lead to more hypertrophy. Now again, the reason I don't go around saying this a lot is because it's probably not as simple as that, and it's very far from being like the thing. And so when Titin is being held when passive tension and its effects on Titin are being held as responsible for all of stretch-mediated hypertrophy's effect, essentially, that's again being reductionist and or making a claim without sufficient evidence, in my view. So that's where I stand on that.
Yeah, I've seen some connotation on the extracellular matrix versus Titin in producing passive tension, and this is something like that Lieber really writes about. This is where I've seen most of his papers come from, on how there was a study measuring mouse and frogs, and then the frogs' ECM, extracellular matrix, produced less than 5% passive tension. But I was talking to him and he said that the ECM for the frogs is very dense, or sorry, it's much less dense than the humans or mammals. And then so it seemed to be, I don't know if it was calculated or theorized, he said that for humans at least, or for mammals, the passive tension for the ECM tends to be around 50%. So maybe near Titin. Do you know any maybe research supporting that the ECM could be a passive tension, or maybe anything other than Titin? There's a lot of research revolving around not just Titin being the main driver.
Yeah, so I know that more proteins are involved in muscle growth signaling than just Titin for sure. I also know that Titin isn't the only thing being stretched and providing passive tension during the lengthening phase. I can say I'm much more familiar with the research than that, and I can say, again, it's the sort of thing where I'm not sure how directly related or pertinent this is to the muscle length and range of motion research until we have things directly linking the two. I think ideally, and kind of this is where I want the range of motion research to go in the future. First, I'd just like to see some more evidence around lengthened partials versus full range of motion to see whether there's some benefit to lengthened partials over full range of motion for muscle hypertrophy, to kind of give practitioners an idea of, well, this might be a good idea to do if you're looking to optimize muscle hypertrophy as a response, right? But the second thing would be to see, once we've got that understanding, to measure some mechanistic stuff, like maybe measure passive tension during the exercise, maybe measure some molecular data to see what's going on there, to gradually hone in to a response to, okay, well, what's the mechanism at play? But I think for the time being, while I find the mechanistic under discussion fairly interesting, if it's being had especially with a good degree of uncertainty and a good degree of caution being discussed, I think it's fine. But I think until we have direct data on it, or until we have more on that stuff, I think it's speculation at best, or it might be misleading in some senses, because it might mean that you come to the conclusion that certain muscle groups don't respond or do respond when you have evidence to the contrary that's directly suggesting. When you put the mechanism before the direct evidence, to me that's kind of missing the forest for your favorite tree.
Yeah.
Like you're missing the outcome data on hypertrophy because your favorite tree is so interesting to you. So that's how I view it.
Yeah, I know a lot of people are talking about, and I've gone into discussions with people talking about Titin and all that. And as much as I love the concept, it is like, yeah, sure, I've read some papers on it, but my gosh, it's so much more complicated than people think it is. I don't make videos discussing. I have some videos discussing on Titin, but I don't like to kind of go into that whole thing on. This is, I say that is a possibility, and I could describe maybe some mechanisms to my understanding, but it's just, I leave it to like Lieberman and all those people, or Lieber, to really discuss that, because some people tend to think they're data, and then they start ranting onto some things that it's like, if someone like of an expert in the field really were to read that, he goes, that's not how that works. Like, that's not. And that actually leads me to the Bicep study from Brad that many people talk about, many people dislike. They said it was a bad study. And they said that the bicep firstly, why is it always that a lot of bicep studies tend to use a preacher curl? I know a lot of people ask that, if that is not a fully length bicep. And I remember you talked about that. That only applies to the long head of the bicep.
Yeah, so the reason I think at least is because A, it's a relatively static exercise, so it's relatively easy to control range of motion in this case. Whereas with standing curl, there might be a movement of other joints a little bit more. and which makes it more difficult to control range of motion accurately. And the second thing is that also then potentially involves other joints or other muscle groups a lot more than the elbow flexors. So depending on how much instruction is being given and how much supervision is being given by the researchers, it might mean that they're starting to, use their front delts, extend their hips during the movement, or extend their calves, what have you. And that can obviously add confounders that otherwise wouldn't be there with preach curl.
And for the leverages, because I know they equated torque or leverage in that study by doing like the partial range used less weight, and then the upper range used like heavier weight.
Yep.
You said that even if there were changes in leverage, that wouldn't matter if they trained to failure, if they had equal effort. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. So certainly there could be differences in... Again, it kind of comes down to how important you think the differences in muscle recruitment due to neuromechanical matching are, and how relevant they are to hypertrophy. If you think they're super meaningful, like for example, in the 0 and let's say to 64 degrees versus 64 to 128, I think it was. If you think there's huge differences in recruitment between those two ranges of motion, then you could say that yes, even though both groups trained to failure and used appropriate loads to make each range of motion stimulating, you could say that, well, if we measured the biceps brachii cross-sectional area, then it's not going to be the same ultimately, because the activation or the recruitment of the biceps in the bottom 68 degrees is greater than at the top. So even though you're using enough weight to compensate, the bottom inherently trains the biceps better due to the internal moment arm, or to the leverage, sorry. So you could make that argument. It depends on how meaningful you think the differences are. I think that because the differences likely aren't meaningful enough to really impact hypertrophy, my view at least, until we have evidence suggesting that it is meaningful enough, like there's a meaningful enough difference in leverage between the bottom range of motion and top range of motion for the biceps brachii. At the top, for example, maybe the other elbow flexors take over, or at the bottom, the biceps brachii take over. If there is a meaningful enough difference in which elbow flexors get trained predominantly, that might be the case. But ultimately, I think if the difference is relatively small, and importantly, all sets were performed to failure, then in either range of motion, the biceps should have received, all else being equal, a pretty good stimulus, right? Like maybe they weren't being trained to failure in the top range of motion, like the partial range of motion at short muscle lengths, but they were hopefully being trained close enough to failure that there shouldn't have been a difference on that account. So I think what we're seeing is stretch-mediated hypertrophy here. Again, until we have evidence suggesting that neuromechanical matching and differences in recruitment owing to neuromechanical matching are relevant in the context of different ranges of motion in these studies, until we have that data, I think I'd rather take it at relative face value, let's say.
Right. And Chris and Paul always, I guess, dismantle that study by saying that only measured regional hypertrophy, distal hypertrophy. It wasn't stretch-mediated hypertrophy. Just because the internal or the moment arm of the exercise, or it was more difficult.
I mean, they measured cross-sectional area both 50 and 70%, right? So they looked at one relatively, I guess, intermediate site and one relatively distal site. Sure, you saw greater hypertrophy at the more distal site and not much greater hypertrophy at the more proximal site. But when you look at the wider body of evidence, even proximally sometimes, longer muscle length training does appear to lead to more hypertrophy. So I guess it's another sort of point against potentially the claim that passive tension and fascicle length adaptations are the mechanisms at play, is that sometimes even proximal hypertrophy is greater. So that might kind of throw a wrench in that hypothesis.
Yeah, and then, well, that's basically what everyone's saying now. Like, they're pretty much just like repeating Paul. They're like, that study measured, it didn't measure fascicle length. Well, I mean, can we even measure fascicle length? I think that's a lot more complicated.
Yeah, it's a lot more complicated. It's not easy to measure fascicle length. I think it requires a pretty good degree of training on the equipment as well. It's not super easy for researchers to do necessarily. And so that's why also I think we need more data on fascicle length, for example, to see whether or not it's at play, to what extent it's at play. And that's also why you don't just look at one or two studies on fascicle length and make strong conclusions based on those two studies.
Yeah, because and then everyone now goes, oh, that the study was distal hypertrophy, and I'm like, well, did you even read the study?
Yeah.
And they just sent me Chris's Patreon thing or Paul Carter's post, and I'm like, I'd rather just look at the source. Another thing is that they say that if a muscle has no leverage, or the internal moment arm is, I guess, not as great in a certain position, it can no longer contribute. I remember people were starting to talk about, for example, front delt pressing. I mean, this goes for, I guess, any muscle, I think. If you press below 90 degrees, the moment arm of the, was it front delt, decreases, therefore it's no longer, it's lengthening, but it's not contributing. And I talked to, I sent this to Andrew again, because I'm like, all right, well, let me just see what this guy says, because this does not seem good to me. And he goes, well, first of all, the moment arm is not zero. It's always contributing. And he said something about that if muscle is lengthening, it might actually have to produce more force to equate torque, something like that.
Yeah, well, again, it comes back to the thing where, are there differences in recruitment based on the leverage of a muscle group at different angles? Yeah, for sure. But as you said, and as Andrew said, it's never going to be zero. And whether or not the difference in recruitment at different joint angles is meaningful enough to cause a difference in hypertrophy when a set is taken close to failure or to failure, that's very uncertain. Yeah, I think in the case of the overhead press, for example, especially when there are relatively few other muscle groups capable of performing that function, or relatively few other muscle groups that have much better leverage, which in this case, to my knowledge at least, there's not a ton of better shoulder flexors than the front delts, right? Maybe the upper chest a little bit. But in that case, yeah, I would be relatively skeptical that they wouldn't get a meaningful hypertrophy benefit from that exercise.
Yeah, and people take this in a sense. It's like, oh, well, if it's no longer working there, I'm not going to be doing below pressing 90 degrees. I think some people just say that because they just don't want to go all the way down because it's too painful.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think when we try to apply it, I mean, at least for me, I like, if someone tells me the lats aren't going to be active over 120 degrees, first of all, I just look at them with like the straightest face. But secondly, it's more like am I only trying to grow my lats? Like, I mean, I'm not as jacked as Paul or anybody or maybe even you, but I mean,
Hey, Paul's been eating my back. Did you see that?
what happened?
So I had an exchange with Paul Carter a few months ago where I was commenting under a post on TikTok because a person asked me to comment under a post talking about stretch-mediated hypertrophy. I commented sort of what I thought of the evidence, and the guy who made the video didn't actually reply, but Paul did. And then what ensued was him. I uploaded a rear lat spread picture of me and tagged Paul Carter just for the fun of it because he would talk shit about Greg Knuckles, like he said, oh yeah, Greg is a dumbass, etc.
He called him a dad bod, I think, too.
Sorry?
He called him. He said he said he called him a dad bod with
Incredible, incredible. Anyways, I tagged him, said your move, Paul Carter, or something like official response to Paul Carter, just me flexing. And then he sent me a picture saying, dude, my back literally ate your back. So, Paul been eating,
Yeah, and for me, it's like I'm not only trying to grow my lats again. Back to where it was like, what if I just want to grow my teres or something as well, even if it's like a minimal growth. Secondly, a lot of people think they're like, why do you even say this stuff when you're not even as jacked as Paul or something like that? And I'm like, well, first of all, like getting jacked is not my main priority right now. I honestly like to eat food and I like to work out. So would I like to get jacked? Sure, but it's more of a slow process for me. It's not really something I care about at the moment. I care looking good, just not bodybuilding competition wise. Maybe in the future, but
hey, who knows?
just to get my foot in the mud like you did. Because I wouldn't train somebody for competition if I've never done it. Now, we are running out of time, and I do have a Q&A for the people that wanted to ask you some questions on my Patreon. So maybe we could kind of like give an answer for these, maybe choose a couple of these questions.
Yeah, let's
some
do
of them we have already talked about, but maybe you could give like a brief summary of it. Let's start with this one. The stretch-mediated hypertrophy muscle increase muscle cross-sectional area and series, or just sarcomeres and series, and do magnitudes of stretch-mediated hypertrophy vary depending on muscles? We have talked about this, but maybe you could give like a simple explanation for the people to kind of take home.
Yeah, it's not super clear yet, but I suspect it's both, so both in series and in parallel. Um, for the time being, I think the generalizable principle of all muscle groups respond to stretch-mediated hypertrophy is likely true. Now, how that interacts with, for example, neuromechanical matching or certain exercises, like for example, doing a lengthened partial on an incline curl versus on a preach curl, and how that might change things for individual elbow flexors, isn't super clear yet. But generally, the idea that all else being equal, training a given muscle group at longer muscle lengths with the same amount of tension and everything is better for hypertrophy, I think at this point is a reasonably generalizable principle that applies to all muscle groups.
Okay. I mean, and some muscle groups you can't really stretch as far though, right?
Yeah, but that's why I'm saying like comparing apples to apples, like same muscle group being stretched less or more, with the same amount of tension being applied or produced, or both. I do think training at lower muscle lengths is generally more productive for hypertrophy, and certainly now that we have evidence on calves, triceps, biceps, quads, hamstrings, glutes, adductors, we have a good wealth or a good variety of muscle groups of a variety of shapes even, and it does generally seem to hold true that training a muscle group at lower muscle lengths is beneficial for hypertrophy.
Okay, this one's funny. What are your thoughts on Dr. Sokos' interpretation of SMA, of stretch-mediated hypertrophy in a live person? So if you're not familiar with that one, I can pretty much help you with that. Dr. Soko made a video. I know what he's talking about. Dr. Soko made a video saying that all biceps experience passive tension because, for example, if I'm standing up, my arm's gonna have like a little bend at the end. But if I were to straighten my arm, there's gonna be like a kickback, and it's gonna make my arm kind of come back to like. See if I can stand up and do it. It's like if I straighten out my arm, and then if I let it go, he said that's passive tension. Trying to work on that.
Oh man. I'm not sure I can support or deny that. That seems like a very random claim to make. There might be some truth to it, but I can't say for sure whether that's true or not.
True. I just thought it was like an overly simplification.
Yes. Yeah. It seems like a very sort of like when your grandma tells you if you go outside with your hair cold, with your hair wet, you're gonna get a cold, and then you get a cold, and so you decide, oh, it's true. It's like a very oversimplified understanding of something.
That's a great way to put it. This one says, oh, this is a good one actually. How fast do you believe a person would take to maximize sarcomerogenesis adaptations? And would you know any research that suggests sarcomeres growing in series plateau faster or atrophy compared to myofibrillar or parallel hypertrophy? Well, taking what we already said, that we're not sure how that occurs, or both occurred.
Sure.
Research saying that Chris Beardsley say that when sarcomeres go in series, they tend to plateau faster.
Sure. So what I'd say is, I couldn't say for sure whether they atrophy faster than just traditional muscle growth, quote unquote, or muscle growth that's happening in parallel more so. What I'll say regarding maximizing sarcomerogenesis or sarcomere length longer term, by definition, if you look to maximize something, it'll probably take you a lifetime. It is possible that the adaptations or the bulk of the adaptations happen relatively quickly, and there is some evidence to that effect. But I'd say if you're looking to maximize it, and certainly if you're looking to maximize hypertrophy in your career, quote unquote, then I'd say years and years, probably.
Yeah. So it's not like you could do stretch-mediated hypertrophy for like 6 weeks, and then you got to stop because it plateau.
No, and certainly I wouldn't do stretch-mediated hypertrophy just for 6 weeks, because we're like, if now we knew for sure that it was only sarcomerogenesis at play here that was what was causing stretch-mediated hypertrophy, you could do that. If we knew that was the case, and that after about 6 weeks of longer muscle length training, your sarcomerogenesis is peaked and you're done essentially. But because we don't have the understanding that stretch-mediated hypertrophy is entirely down to that yet, and we don't have the understanding that it's only 6 weeks either, I think longer muscle length training, and it's interesting because in my meta-analysis, I performed a subgroup analysis a meta-regression rather, looking at the effect of how intervention duration or training intervention duration modulated differences in adaptations based on time, and at least when you grouped it by adaptations and sort of very broadly, it didn't seem as though intervention duration played a role. So if there was an effect of, after a few weeks you don't see any additional sarcomerogenesis, at least in that very sort of broad analysis, it wasn't being shown that, after 6 weeks you see a clear reduction in how much full range of motion benefited them in terms of performance adaptations or muscle growth adaptations.
Okay. All right. So I think we have time for two short ones. Is that okay? Um, One of them would be okay. If a muscle can't benefit through a lot of stretch-mediated hypertrophy, I think this is when I'm implying that some muscles have like different magnitudes of the benefit. I guess. Would that mean that its fatigue is proportional to the benefit? I think here is prefer. I think he's referring to Kasim Hansen again, where he said that, for example, if the triceps don't benefit as much stretch-mediated hypertrophy, then they can't accumulate as much as the fatigue because the fatigue is proportional to the stretch, something like that.
Yeah, so that goes on to another debate as to whether or not lower muscle length training is inherently more fatiguing. There's not a ton of direct data on this, and certainly oftentimes the way fatigue is measured is not the most ecologically valid, right? So oftentimes you can measure markers of fatigue, like creatine kinase or what have you, um, but ultimately, I think measuring performance is a better thing to do, and there's just not been a lot of, um, well, measuring return of performance to baseline pre-disruption is a better thing to do to assess performance generally, maybe ideally alongside some molecular markers as well, but that hasn't really been done in relation to long or short muscle length training that much. And so it's possible that lower muscle length training is inherently more fatiguing, and that's why, because it's being trained at lower muscle lengths, it's more fatiguing. But I think that it may also be due, at least in part or in large part, due to novelty, where most people haven't been focusing on lower muscle length training that much. So when they first introduce it, the repeated bout effect isn't really kicking in yet. The repeated bout effect saying that, hey, when you expose yourself to a certain stimulus, over time, your response to that stimulus in terms of fatigue and recovery and so forth lessens. When you've never really trained at lower muscle lengths, that effect of lessening the fatigue or the recovery period over time, that hasn't really kicked in yet. And so inherently, when you first perform lower muscle length training, it may be more fatiguing. I think that's mostly what explains differences in recovery time course following initially introducing lower muscle length training.
I mean, with the triceps specifically, I haven't even seen any research for them that shows that they don't reach the descending limb. Uh, so
Yeah, neither have I.
I mean, I maybe there is, but I haven't seen anything. And the last question would be upper traps versus levator scapulae as prime mover for shrugs. I think this goes back to the whole debate with
I'll be honest, I have no idea. I think without having a look at the
the Johnson
length
study.
tension, yeah, without looking at the length tension relationships for the levator scapulae and the traps, I think that both will likely be trained if they have the same functions, which in this case they kind of do, in this context at least, um, and they both have reasonable leverage at those angles. They will both be trained pretty well, especially if you take set close to failure. So I wouldn't really say, oh, for sure the traps or the levator scapulae. I think both are likely involved, and both will likely grow from shrugs.
I mean, would you say that like if a muscle has like a less cross sectional area, therefore they can't really contribute as much and they work as a stabilizer, or
I mean, you could make the opposite argument. You could say that I don't think it's a strong argument either way, but you could make the opposite argument where because they're a small muscle group, they have to contract with their full. They have to be recruited more. They have to be recruited earlier in order to contribute to the task and thus get a better stimulus. But I think ultimately, independent of their exact size, I think if they perform a function and they have reasonable leverage, and by reasonable I mean like any decent leverage, and the task is being taken close enough to failure, like momentary muscular failure, that muscle group will likely grow well enough.
so basically the take home today would just be make sure to train near failure, and the muscles would basically be
Yeah, pretty much. I think the take homes are A, we don't know what the mechanisms behind stretch mediated hypertrophy are yet for sure. Anyone telling you otherwise is probably wrong. Um, that provided you're taking a set reasonably close to failure, differences in neuromechanical matching may not necessarily matter. And until we have data suggesting the contrary, I wouldn't be inclined to believe that they would. Um, yeah, and that generally longer muscle length training is probably a good idea for hypertrophy.
uh, do you have any studies coming out more that are you familiar with?
Yes. I'm currently conducting two studies. One study in the calves comparing, so everyone's training both calves, but it's a within subject design, which means one calf is being trained with full range of motion, and one calf is being trained with partial range of motion. The partial range of motion is half the full range of motion in the middle of the four-range of motion, which no study so far has done. So essentially trying to equate for the average muscle length being trained to an extent. So that hopefully we can see, okay, well, does range of motion only influence hypertrophy insofar as it is mediated by muscle length, or is there an independent effect of range of motion itself independent of muscle length on hypertrophy? So measuring hypertrophy before and after 10 weeks of training, one leg being trained with full range of motion and one leg being trained with partial range of motion, trying to match for muscle length being trained. And then the second study is a between subject design where people are assigned to one of two groups. One group is training the upper body with full range of motion. One group is training the upper body with a partial range of motion, specifically half the full range of motion in the lengthened position. And this is across a full training program. So it's 3 days a week of upper body training, about 8 to 15 sets per muscle group per week to failure, all of them. So pretty hard training, pretty similar training to what people would do in the gym as well. So between 6 and 15 reps for all sets. And measuring hypertrophy before and after using the ultrasound on the biceps and triceps for more proximal to more distal sites. Measuring hypertrophy as well using a more global measure like a bod polydexa or skin folds. And measuring strength using 6 rep maxes with both a full range of motion and a partial range of motion before and after the study. And we're conducting this study across 5 universities across a year or two, trying to get plenty of people in the study, because ultimately, as I said earlier, when you have one study with 5 people, you can't make really good inferences from that data set. So when we're talking about trained lifters in this case, people who've been training for 3 years or more in the study, and the impact of the relatively smaller impact of a variable like range of motion, we need a big data set to be able to detect differences effectively. So we're trying to get about 50 to 100 people or more across a year or two to answer this question.
Well, I can't wait to read those when they come out.
Hey, me too.
And, it was good to hear answers from, someone who actually follows the data, or at least goes in with more cautious approach to things. So yeah, you really did help clear a lot of these questions, because a lot of these questions are really asked, not necessarily in podcasts. I know Revive Strong is a great podcast, but I think they try to stay away from like the nerdy side.
Yep, sure.
I don't care. I just whatever question comes up, whether it's nerdy or not, if I could get an answer to it, or get a kind of like a better view at it, just to maybe stay safe before making assumptions. Like Paul.
For sure, man. It was awesome.
Well, thank you so much. If Paul sees this, maybe makes a podcast about it, and maybe we have another reason to go back at it with more studies. So,
For sure.
Hope you have a great day, Milo.
Thank you. You too, man. Take care.
You too. Thank you.